The cabinet stood 7 feet tall, walnut veneer gone amber under 40 years of varnish, its glass doors reflecting the August heat that pressed through Dr. Willard Crane's examination room windows. Inside, arranged on velvet like jeweler's stock, sat 237 human teeth. Each rested in its own shallow depression, sorted by size and marked with tags in Crane's meticulous script. Molar, age 9, female. Incisor, age 6, male. Canine, age 12, origin disputed. The tags noted no names, only categories that reduced children to merchandise. When planter Horace Lane arrived that afternoon to inspect enslaved workers before purchase, Crane opened the cabinet with the pride of a curator unveiling a collection. "These specimens prove vitality," he said, tapping the glass. "Pain response correlates directly with market value. A child who cries during extraction will work harder to avoid future suffering." Lane nodded, running numbers in his head. What Crane didn't know was that 2 women had already photographed his collection, and the glass plates were hidden inside a piano on a riverboat heading south. Hancock County, Georgia, in 1855 was red clay and cotton, courthouse squares and Methodist bells, a landscape where everyone knew everyone's business except the business conducted behind examination room doors. The county seat of Sparta sat on high ground, overlooking the Oconee River basin, its main street lined with brick storefronts that baked under summer sun until the air itself felt solid. Dr. Willard Crane's practice occupied the 2nd floor of the Masonic Hall, above the druggist and beside the land office, 3 rooms that smelled perpetually of carbolic and something sweeter, the ether he used when white patients required extractions. Crane was 52 that summer, a Virginia native who'd studied 2 years at Transylvania Medical School before finances forced him home to learn the rest through apprenticeship. He'd arrived in Hancock County in 1843 with decent credentials and better references, married the Methodist minister's daughter within 6 months, and built a practice that served both the planter class and their property. His services fell into 2 categories. For white patients, he prescribed laudanum and bed rest, set broken bones with careful splints, and attended difficult births with a dignity that made families grateful even when mothers died. For enslaved people brought to him by their owners, his approach was different. Experimental, he called it. Progressive. The cabinet appeared in his examination room around 1848, commissioned from a furniture maker in Milledgeville and installed with ceremony. Crane told colleagues it represented the future of medical science, the systematic collection of data that would advance understanding of human physiology. What he actually collected were teeth pulled from enslaved children during what he termed pain threshold assessments. The procedure was simple. A planter considering purchase would bring a child to Crane's office. Crane would select a healthy tooth, usually a molar, and extract it without anesthetic while timing how long the child could remain silent. Children who screamed immediately were marked as weak stock. Those who lasted 30 seconds or more were deemed hardy, likely to survive field work. Crane charged $5 per assessment and guaranteed his findings in writing. By 1855, he'd performed the assessment 237 times. The practice wasn't illegal. Georgia law in 1855 treated enslaved people as chattel, subject to whatever examination an owner deemed necessary before purchase. Crane's assessments fell into the same category as checking teeth in horses, a standard due diligence that protected buyers against fraud. Several other physicians in the region had adopted similar methods, though none with Crane's devotion to record-keeping. He logged each extraction in a leather-bound ledger, noting the child's approximate age, sex, which tooth was removed, duration of silence, and the eventual sale price if he learned it. The ledger sat on his desk like any other medical record, consulted when planters asked for comparative data. What troubled his wife, Constance, was not the practice itself, but the cabinet. She'd walked into his examination room one afternoon to find him polishing the glass doors, arranging the teeth in tighter rows to make space for new acquisitions. The pride in his posture, the tenderness with which he handled each specimen, disturbed her in ways she couldn't articulate to anyone who would understand. She mentioned it once to her father, Reverend Morris, who reminded her that a physician's work required detachment from sentiment. Scientific progress, he said, often appeared unseemly to those without medical training. She didn't raise the subject again. The white community of Sparta viewed Crane as a respectable professional, perhaps a bit odd in his enthusiasms but fundamentally sound. He attended church every Sunday, served on the county medical board, and contributed to the volunteer fire company. His assessments generated income for local planters by reducing bad purchases. Several families owed him money, which he never pressed to collect, understanding that goodwill mattered more than prompt payment in a small community. He was, by the standards of Hancock County's white society, a valued citizen. But there were two women who saw him differently. Aunt Millie's cabin sat at the edge of the Lattimore plantation, 3 miles south of Sparta, where the road dissolved into wagon tracks and the sound of the river rose at night like breathing. She was 67 that summer, though no one knew her exact age, not even Millie herself. Her grandmother had been a healer in a place across the ocean whose name changed depending on who asked, and Millie had inherited the knowledge, the packets of dried root and leaf, the knowing when to push and when to wait. White families called for her when childbirth went wrong or fever climbed past what home remedies could touch. Enslaved families called for her when calling anyone else would mean punishment or separation. She delivered 432 babies in Hancock County. 16 of those babies had later been brought to Dr. Crane's office for assessment. 8 had returned. 8 had been sold immediately after, scattered to plantations in Alabama and Mississippi, whose names Millie learned from mothers who spoke them once, and then never again. The grief was specific and cumulative. Each child taken added weight to a total Millie carried in her body, like stones in a sack. Nora Hale taught reading to enslaved children in the woods behind the Congregational Church, a violation of Georgia law that could earn her imprisonment if discovered. She was 29, unmarried, a New Hampshire native who'd come south in 1852 with the American Missionary Association and stayed when the AMA withdrew its official support. She lived in a boarding house on Sparta's west edge, employed nominally as a music teacher for white families, a cover that gave her access to homes where she observed and listened. Her students gathered on Tuesday and Thursday nights in a clearing 200 yards into the timber, where overhanging branches blocked sight lines from the road. 11 of her students had been taken to Dr. Crane. 4 had returned. Millie and Nora met in the winter of 1854 at the cabin of a woman named Sarah, whose daughter had died 2 days after Crane's assessment from infection that turned the extraction site black. Sarah was beyond speech by then, rocking in the corner while Millie tried to bring down the fever with willow bark tea and wet cloths. Nora had come because Sarah's son was one of her students, and when children stopped attending, she went to find out why. The two women worked together through the night, saying little, learning each other's competence through gesture and timing. Sarah died at dawn. They buried her in a plot beyond the tree line while her son read from Genesis in halting syllables, and afterward, walking back through morning light, Millie said, "Someone needs to make him stop." Nora said, "He keeps records. If we could get them, if we could show people, white people don't care what gets shown, Millie interrupted. They already know. Some might care, Nora said. Some might care if they saw. That was the seed. It took months to grow. Marcus Webb came to Sparta in May of 1855 with a wagon full of equipment and a handbill advertising photographic portraiture at reasonable rates. He was a free black man from Charleston, 34 years old, trained in daguerreotype before switching to the newer wet plate collodion process that produced glass negatives and paper prints. He'd been traveling through Georgia's interior since March, stopping in county seats to photograph white families who wanted permanent records of their prosperity. The work paid adequately and gave him access to places and conversations that a black man couldn't otherwise enter. He also photographed enslaved families when he could do so without attracting attention, taking portraits that he delivered directly to subjects with instructions to hide them. These images were gifts, offered without charge, because Webb understood that memory needed anchors and photographs could serve as proof of existence when all other documentation treated people as inventory. He kept no record of these sessions. The negatives went into the family's possession immediately. Webb moved on before questions could form. Nora found him 3 days after his arrival, approaching his wagon in the early evening when the street traffic had thinned. She introduced herself as a music teacher and asked if he'd be willing to photograph a collection of medical specimens for documentation purposes. Webb studied her carefully, noting the Yankee accent and the way she didn't quite meet his eyes, the tension that suggested she was asking for something more than she'd stated. "What kind of specimens?" he asked. "The kind that need witnessing," Nora said. They met again the following night behind the Congregational Church, this time with Millie present. Millie did most of the talking, her voice low and factual as she described Crane's cabinet, the assessments, the children who'd been sold or who'd died. Webb listened without interrupting, his hands still in his lap. When Millie finished, he asked 3 questions. Where was the cabinet located? What hours was the office empty? Who else knew about this plan? "Just us," Nora said. Webb was silent for a full minute. Then he said, "This will cost you nothing and cost me everything if it fails. I need to know you understand that." "We understand," Millie said. "If we're caught, I hang. You probably go to prison. People will say I coerced you, that I'm the instigator. They won't believe 2 women conceived this on their own." "We know," Nora said quietly. Webb nodded once. "Then we'll need to move quickly, and we'll need somewhere safe to store the negatives until we know what to do with them." That question turned out to be harder than the photography itself. Dr. Crane's office was never truly locked. The main door required a key, but the window on the north side, facing the alley between the Masonic Hall and the saddlery, had a latch that didn't quite catch. Crane had mentioned it to the building's owner twice, and twice been told that repairs would come when budget allowed. The oversight proved useful. Nora entered first, at 2:30 a.m. on June 9, 1855, a Tuesday chosen because Crane had mentioned in passing that he'd be traveling to Milledgeville that week for a medical conference. She wore dark clothes borrowed from Millie's cabin and carried a shielded candle that cast barely enough light to navigate. The examination room smelled of carbolic and old blood, the walls lined with anatomical charts and shelves of brown bottles whose labels promised relief from everything from neuralgia to female hysteria. The cabinet stood against the east wall, its glass doors catching her candle's reflection. She opened it slowly, the hinges releasing a faint squeal that made her freeze. Nothing stirred in the building. She lifted the candle higher. The teeth were smaller than she'd imagined. That was the first shock. Looking at them arranged in rows, sorted by type and size, she'd expected something more substantial, more obviously horrifying. Instead, they looked almost delicate. The molars no bigger than corn kernels, the incisors thin as paper edges. The tags beneath each specimen were written in Crane's elegant script, the same handwriting she'd seen on prescriptions and church donation receipts. The ordinariness of it, the neat rows, the careful labels, the professional presentation, was somehow worse than chaos would have been. She signaled through the window. Webb came up the back stairs carrying his camera box and chemicals, moving with the economy of someone who'd done this kind of work in spaces where discovery meant death. He set up the tripod in front of the cabinet, adjusted the angle, poured collodion onto a glass plate in the darkroom corner that Crane used for storage. The process required 8 minutes per exposure. They had planned for 6 images, 2 wide shots of the full cabinet, 4 close details of different sections. Millie stood watch in the alley, dressed as a cleaning woman, bucket and rags visible if anyone approached. The street stayed empty. Sparta at 3 a.m. was a town of closed shutters and sleeping dogs, the only movement coming from the river wind that rattled loose boards and sent leaves skittering across cobblestones. Webb finished the first plate, slid it into the silver bath to fix the image, moved on to the second position. His hands stayed steady, but Nora could see sweat on his forehead despite the cool night air. If they were caught, the scenario was obvious. A black man with photographic equipment in a white doctor's office in the middle of the night. No jury in Georgia would deliberate longer than 10 minutes. The hanging would happen within a week. "Why are you doing this?" Nora whispered while he prepared the third plate. Webb didn't look up from his work. "My daughter was 8 when they sold her, 9 years ago. Man who bought her said she was prime stock, good teeth, strong constitution. I think about that every time I set up this camera." They finished at 4:15 a.m., 6 clean negatives wrapped in black cloth and packed into Webb's wagon. They'd left no obvious trace. The cabinet stood exactly as they'd found it. Doors closed, specimens undisturbed. Crane would return from Milledgeville none the wiser, his collection intact, his practice continuing without interruption. But now his specimens existed in 2 places. The negatives were proof, but proof required context, and context required risk. Webb, Nora, and Millie met again 2 nights later in the woods behind the church, sitting on logs in the clearing where Nora's students usually gathered. Webb had developed prints from each negative, paper images that showed the cabinet in stark detail, the rows of teeth, the labels, the clinical precision of the arrangement. Looking at them in daylight made the horror more concrete. These were not abstract specimens. These were pieces of children's bodies, catalogued and displayed. "We need to get these to someone who can act on them," Nora said. "A newspaper, maybe, or a judge." "No white judge in Georgia will care," Millie said flatly. "Show him these pictures and he'll ask if Crane had permission from the owners. When you say yes, he'll rule it was legal business." "What about northern newspapers?" Nora asked. "The Tribune or—" "Time," Webb interrupted. "Mail to New York takes 2 weeks minimum. They'd need to verify the story, send a correspondent if they believed it. We're talking months before anything gets published. And by then, Crane will know someone's been in his office. He'll hide the cabinet, destroy the ledger. We lose the physical evidence." They sat in silence, mosquitoes whining in the humid air. Somewhere in the darkness, a child coughed, the sound carrying from the distant slave quarters. Finally, Millie spoke. "There's a preacher," she said. "Comes through on the riverboat every 6 weeks. holds revival services at different plantations. Name's Josiah Kern. He's different. Asks questions about how people are treated. Last winter, he refused to hold service at the Daniels place after he saw children working in weather that would kill a mule. Some folks think he's too meddlesome, but the planters tolerate him because he brings religion to places that don't have regular churches. You think he'd help? Nora asked. I think he'd listen, Millie said. Whether he'd do anything after listening, that I don't know. But his boat comes through here at the end of the month. We could try. Webb considered this. A preacher with a traveling ministry would have reasons to carry unusual cargo. Documents, sheet music, religious texts. If we could convince him to take the negatives somewhere safe until we figure out the next step. It's still a risk, Nora said. We'd be trusting someone we barely know. We're already trusting each other, Millie pointed out. And we barely knew each other 4 months ago. The decision was made. Josiah Kern's riverboat was called the Gospel Star, a flat-bottomed stern-wheeler that carried freight and passengers between Augusta and Milledgeville, stopping at plantation landings to deliver supplies and gather cotton bales. Kern had purchased it in 1853 with money inherited from a Philadelphia uncle, converted the main cabin into a chapel, and spent half the year traveling Georgia's waterways, bringing Methodist services to communities too small or scattered for permanent churches. The other half of the year he spent in Savannah, where he taught at a freedmen's school and wrote pamphlets arguing that slavery corrupted Christian virtue. He was 41, unmarried, regarded by conservative clergy as a dangerous radical, and by abolitionists as insufficiently committed. The truth was somewhere between. Kern believed slavery was evil, but he also believed that immediate emancipation without preparation would lead to chaos and violence. He preached gradual manumission, education for enslaved people, and compensation for owners who freed their workers voluntarily. These positions satisfied no one, but allowed him to maintain his ministry in a region where more aggressive stances would have gotten him expelled or killed. His piano was a Chickering Square Grand, purchased used in 1851 and installed in the Gospel Stars Chapel. It had a deep cabinet below the keyboard, designed for storing sheet music, that Kern had modified with a false bottom after discovering that several enslaved musicians he worked with needed places to hide items they couldn't keep in quarters where nothing was private. The modification wasn't sophisticated, just a board that lifted out to reveal 6 inches of hidden space. But it had served well over the years for letters, money, and once a set of manumission papers that an owner had drunkenly signed and then tried to reclaim when sober. Millie approached him on June 27, 1855, at the plantation landing south of Sparta, where the Gospel Star had tied up for an evening service. She waited until the white families had finished their supper and retired to the main house, leaving the enslaved workers gathered on the lawn for what Kern called the second service. He preached for an hour about Moses and Pharaoh, drawing parallels that everyone understood, but no one could openly acknowledge. Afterward, while others drifted back to their quarters, Millie stayed. "Reverend, I need to show you something that's going to make you angry," she said. They walked to the boat. In the chapel, under lamplight, she spread out Webb's photographs on the top of the piano. Kern studied them in silence, his face going through stages: confusion, comprehension, disgust, and finally something colder. He picked up one of the close detail images, holding it near the lamp to see the tag beneath a molar. Age 7, female, duration 45 seconds. "Who took these?" he asked. "A photographer who's already gone," Millie said, which was true. Webb had left Sparta 3 days earlier, heading toward Augusta with his wagon and equipment. We need them safe. We need them to matter. But if we keep them here or try to mail them north, they'll get discovered and destroyed. I thought maybe... She gestured at the piano. Kern looked at it, then back at the photographs, then at Millie. You know what you're asking could get me killed. I know what Dr. Crane is doing is killing children, Millie said. Slowly or quickly, but killing them, and he's proud of it. These pictures, they're the only proof that exists outside his office. Kern was silent for a long time. Then he said, There's going to be a church tribunal in Milledgeville this autumn. Baptist and Methodist clergy from across Middle Georgia, gathering to discuss doctrinal matters and elect new leadership. If these photographs could be presented there, in front of witnesses who have authority... He trailed off, thinking. But I'd need testimony. Pictures alone won't be enough. People will say they're faked or taken out of context. I'd need parents willing to speak. Parents talk, they get sold, Millie said. Or worse. I know. Kern folded the photographs carefully and lifted the piano's lid, revealing the keyboard. Give me until autumn. Let me think about how to do this without getting everyone killed. Can you wait that long? Millie thought about the children who would be assessed between now and autumn, the teeth that would join Crane's collection, the mothers who would grieve. Then she thought about the alternative, acting rashly, losing the evidence, achieving nothing. We can wait, she said, but not forever. Kern lifted the false bottom in the piano's cabinet and slid the photographs inside, along with a note in his own hand documenting where and when they were taken. Then he replaced the board and closed the lid. These stay hidden until the tribunal, he said. If something happens to me before then, if the boat sinks or I die, you'll need to find another way. But I promise you, if I'm alive in October, these will be seen. 3 months felt like forever. But autumn was coming. The rains began on July 19th and didn't stop for 11 days. The Oconee rose 6 feet in the first week, spilling into bottomland fields and turning roads into channels of red mud. By the 27th, the river was 15 feet above normal, pushing through Sparta's lower district and forcing families to evacuate to higher ground. The Baptist church flooded, water reaching the third pew. The covered bridge 3 miles north collapsed, its timbers spinning downstream like matches. Livestock drowned in pastures that became lakes overnight. Dr. Crane's office stayed dry. The Masonic Hall sat on Sparta's highest ground. But his business suffered as roads became impassable, and planters postponed their usual rounds of slave purchasing. He spent the rainy days organizing his records, updating his ledger, writing letters to colleagues in other counties, describing his assessment methodology in detail that bordered on obsessive. His wife, Constance, noticed that he spent more time than usual in his examination room with the cabinet doors open, as though the specimens provided comfort during the storm. The Gospel Star was caught 40 miles downriver when the flooding started. Kern had been conducting services at a series of small plantations along the Oconee's eastern bank, and he tried to reach Milledgeville before the river became unnavigable. He made it within 10 miles before the current became too strong, the water moving too fast for the stern-wheeler's modest engine to fight. He tied up at a landing owned by the Claremont plantation and waited for the waters to recede. The wait lasted 9 days. During that time, Kern worried constantly about the photographs hidden in his piano, imagining scenarios where the boat sank or was damaged badly enough that salvagers would discover the hidden compartment. He thought about moving them to a different hiding place, but anywhere else on the boat, carried equal or greater risk. The piano cabinet had served well for years. He decided to trust it. On August 2nd, the river finally began dropping. Kern waited another day to ensure the current had stabilized, then cast off and headed upriver toward Milledgeville. The Gospel Star moved slowly against the flow, burning extra coal to make headway, passing debris fields where entire trees clustered against bridge pylons and drowned cattle bobbed in eddies. The destruction was comprehensive. Every plantation they passed showed damage. Fields scoured of topsoil, outbuildings collapsed, cotton crops destroyed. The economic impact would be catastrophic for the region, which meant, Kern realized, that planters would be desperate to recoup their losses. Desperate planters made quick decisions about which workers to keep and which to sell. There would be more assessments at Dr. Crane's office in the coming months, more children tested, more teeth in that cabinet. The photographs he carried weren't just historical evidence anymore. They were documentation of an ongoing crisis that the flood had made worse. He reached Milledgeville on August 5th and sent word to Millie through the network of river workers who carried messages between landings. The message was simple. I still have your package. The tribunal happens October 20th. Be ready. Horace Lane owned 3,000 acres south of Sparta, worked by 214 enslaved people who grew cotton, corn, and enough vegetables to keep the operation self-sufficient. The flood had destroyed 40% of his cotton crop and damaged 3 of his storage barns beyond repair. His losses totaled $17,000, a sum that would require either selling land or selling workers to cover. He chose workers. On August 10th, 1855, Lane visited Dr. Crane's office with 12 children between the ages of 7 and 14, all healthy enough to bring good prices at the Savannah slave market if they could be certified as prime stock. Crane conducted assessments on all 12 over the course of 3 hours, extracting 1 tooth from each child, timing their silence, recording the results in his ledger with his usual precision. 9 of the children lasted more than 30 seconds. 3 screamed immediately. Lane made note of which children showed the most endurance and planned his sale accordingly. Crane's fee for the day was $60 paid in cash, the largest single payment he'd received in months. The teeth went into the cabinet, bringing his collection to 249 specimens. He updated his labels, cross-referenced his records, and wrote a brief note to a colleague in Milledgeville describing the session as highly productive. Subjects demonstrated remarkable variation in pain tolerance, confirming my hypothesis regarding genetic predisposition to suffering. That night, Constance Crane heard her husband in his study, not working, but sitting in the dark. When she brought him a lamp, he was staring at nothing, his hands pressed flat against the desk surface. "Are you well?" she asked. "I'm considering expanding the collection," he said. "Perhaps a second cabinet. The specimens are accumulating faster than anticipated, and I'm running out of organized space. A larger display would allow for better categorization, separation by age brackets, or perhaps by origin region. There are patterns I'm only beginning to see." Constance set the lamp down carefully. "Willard, have you considered that perhaps the collection is sufficient as it stands?" "Sufficient?" He looked at her with genuine confusion. "Science is never sufficient. Every specimen teaches us something new. These children, their responses, the data I'm gathering, this could revolutionize how we understand physiology, how we predict worker quality, how we prevent bad purchases. I'd be doing the community a disservice if I stopped now." She wanted to say that the community didn't need this service, that the children deserved better than being reduced to data points in his ledger. But she'd been raised to defer to male authority, to trust that her husband understood things she couldn't grasp. And so she only said, "I'll leave you to your work," and withdrew. The second cabinet was never built. Events moved too quickly. Millie began approaching parents in late August, moving carefully through the network of quarters and cabins that connected Hancock County's enslaved population. She focused on families whose children had been assessed by Crane and survived, avoiding those whose children had died because grief made people unpredictable, and unpredictability led to exposure. The conversation was always the same. Quiet words exchanged while working in fields or at evening gatherings, asking if they'd be willing to speak about what happened to their children if there was a chance, small but real, that it might stop Dr. Crane. Most said no. The risk was too great. Speaking against a white man, particularly one as well-connected as Crane, meant inviting punishment that would fall not just on the speaker, but on their entire family. Planters didn't need proof to sell workers who caused trouble. Suspicion was enough. One woman told Millie, "I'd rather keep my son alive and silent than lose him trying to save other people's children." Millie understood. She didn't push, but 4 parents said yes. Rebecca, whose daughter Lily had been assessed at age 9 and sold 3 days later. Rebecca was 32, a houseworker at the Daniels plantation, who could read because her previous owner had been eccentric enough to allow it. She kept a hidden journal where she'd written down everything she remembered about the assessment: the date, the time of day, Crane's exact words, how Lily had looked when she came home with her mouth bleeding and one tooth gone. The journal was evidence, if anyone would listen. Thomas, whose son Marcus had been assessed at age 7 and had lost consciousness during the extraction, waking minutes later to find Dr. Crane irritated that the assessment had been interrupted. Marcus lived but developed a terror of enclosed spaces afterward, would panic if put in the root cellar or storage sheds, couldn't explain why. Thomas was 41, worked as a blacksmith, was considered valuable enough that his owner might hesitate before selling him, which meant his testimony carried slightly less risk than others. Violet, whose twin daughters had both been assessed on the same day, age 8, Dr. Crane noting in his records that the experiment of testing siblings allowed for interesting comparisons. One daughter had lasted 43 seconds in silence. The other had screamed immediately. Both were still at the Lattimore plantation, working in the fields, neither able to chew properly on the left side of their mouths. Violet was 29 and had nothing left to lose. "He hurt my babies for science," she told Millie. "If speaking up gets me sold, at least I'll have said what happened." And Joseph, whose son Daniel had been assessed at age 12 and had contracted infection from the extraction site, spending 2 weeks fevered and delirious before Millie's herbs finally brought the swelling down. Daniel survived, but the infection had damaged the jawbone, left him with chronic pain that made eating difficult. Joseph was 56, too old to bring a good price if sold, which made him expendable but also less threatening to his owner. He would speak, he told Millie, because he'd lived long enough to know that silence didn't protect anyone. 4 testimonies, 4 families willing to stand in front of church officials and describe what Dr. Crane had done. Millie sent word to Josiah Kern through the river network, and Kern sent back confirmation. The tribunal was scheduled for October 20th in Milledgeville. He would arrange for the witnesses to attend, would provide transportation and protection as much as he could offer. The photographs would be revealed, the testimonies would be heard, and then Kern's message concluded, "We'll see if truth matters." Crane learned something was wrong on September 3rd, though he didn't know what yet. A planter named Sutton visited his office to inquire about an assessment, then mentioned in passing that he'd heard talk, vague, unspecific, about some people asking questions about Crane's methods. Sutton didn't seem concerned, treated it as gossip worth mentioning only because it was unusual. "You know how slaves talk amongst themselves," he said. "Probably nothing, but I thought you should know in case it becomes something." Crane thanked him and showed him out, then stood in his examination room trying to decode the warning. Questions about his methods. What questions? From whom? He'd always operated openly, with his clients' full knowledge and approval. Every assessment was documented, every fee negotiated and paid, every specimen in his cabinet legally obtained. He'd broken no laws, violated no professional standards. What was there to question? Still, the warning troubled him. He spent the evening reviewing his records, looking for anything that might be considered irregular, finding nothing. His ledger was meticulous. His case notes were thorough. His correspondence with medical colleagues was professional and detailed. If someone challenged his work, he had documentation to support every decision he'd made. What he didn't have was any awareness of the photographs. On September 8th, Nora received a letter from a friend in Milledgeville warning her that the Georgia legislature was considering a law that would criminalize teaching enslaved people to read, with penalties including prison sentences for white offenders and severe physical punishment for black offenders. The law was expected to pass before year's end. Nora's schools in the woods would become not just risky, but explicitly illegal, the kind of activity that attracted prosecution rather than mere social disapproval. She met with Millie to discuss whether they should accelerate their plans, try to bring the photographs to light before October. Millie argued against it. "We've got witnesses lined up. We've got the tribunal scheduled. We've got Reverend Kern ready to present everything in a setting where white clergy will have to respond. If we rush it, if we go to a newspaper or a magistrate right now, we lose that advantage. They'll dismiss it as abolitionist agitation. But in a church tribunal, with preachers as witnesses, it becomes a moral question they can't ignore as easily." "And if the tribunal does nothing?" Nora asked. "Then we've lost nothing we wouldn't lose anyway," Millie said. "But at least we'll have made them see." They decided to wait. The question nobody wanted to ask was how many people had known about Dr. Crane's cabinet and said nothing. The answer, if anyone had been honest, was nearly everyone in Hancock County's white community. Planters who'd used his assessment service, certainly. Their wives who'd heard the details at dinner. The druggist downstairs who filled Crane's orders for ether and carbolic and never questioned why the quantities were so large. The furniture maker in Milledgeville who'd built the cabinet to Crane's specifications and had seen the first specimens placed inside. Reverend Morris, who was Crane's father-in-law and who'd counseled Constance to trust her husband's professional judgment when she'd expressed discomfort about the collection. Knowledge had been widespread but fragmented, everyone seeing one piece of the pattern but not connecting it to the whole. Or perhaps not wanting to connect it, because connection meant complicity, and complicity meant moral responsibility for something most people preferred to classify as regrettable but necessary, unpleasant but legal, troubling but not their concern. What would you do if your community's prosperity depended on a system that required some children to suffer so that others could avoid risk? Would you speak up, knowing that speaking might cost you your livelihood, your social standing, your place in the only world you knew? Would you tell yourself that one person's objection wouldn't change the system anyway? That staying silent was just being realistic? Would you focus on your own family's needs and let other people's children become someone else's problem? These weren't hypothetical questions in Hancock County in 1855. They were daily calculations that white residents made and remade, finding reasons why their participation in or proximity to Crane's work didn't make them responsible for its consequences. The complicity ran deeper than passive acceptance. Several planters had recommended Crane's services to colleagues, praising the efficiency of his methodology. The county medical board, of which Crane was a member, had discussed his assessment technique at a meeting in 1853 and had raised no objections, had even suggested it might be worth publishing in a medical journal as an innovation in livestock evaluation. The Methodist Church, where Crane and his wife attended services every Sunday, had accepted his financial contributions without asking where the money came from. Nora had watched this complicity unfold with increasing frustration over her 3 years in Georgia. She'd grown up in New Hampshire believing that slavery was a distant abstraction, an evil confined to plantations in cotton country that Northerners could oppose without personal cost. Living in Sparta had taught her that evil was never distant, never abstract, and always required participation from ordinary people who thought themselves decent. The planters who brought children to Dr. Crane weren't monsters. They were fathers who played with their own children, husbands who attended church, neighbors who helped each other during floods and fires. They'd simply learned to categorize some children as property and others as precious. And once you accepted that categorization, everything else followed. Breaking that pattern required more than exposing one doctor. It required forcing the community to see what they'd been looking at all along. The Baptist Methodist Tribunal convened in Milledgeville on October 20th, 1855, in the First Baptist Church on Hancock Street. A brick building with tall windows that let in autumn light, and a gallery where observers could watch the proceedings. 63 clergy attended, representing churches from 32 counties across Middle Georgia. The stated agenda focused on doctrinal matters, questions about baptism, church governance, the proper role of clergy in political affairs. But everyone knew the real business was political positioning ahead of the 1856 elections. Josiah Kern arrived on October 18th, his riverboat docking at the wharf below town. He brought the photographs hidden in his piano and the 4 witnesses he'd promised to protect: Rebecca, Thomas, Violet, and Joseph. He'd arranged housing for them at a freedman's boarding house on the edge of town, a place where their presence wouldn't attract immediate attention from white residents who might question why enslaved people were wandering Milledgeville unattended. Millie and Nora came by wagon, arriving on the 19th, staying at a different boarding house. They didn't contact Kern directly, too risky to be seen together before the tribunal, but sent word through intermediaries that they were ready. The tribunal's first day was procedural, establishing rules and electing a chairman. Reverend Amos Hartford from Macon won the position, a moderate who'd managed to avoid taking strong positions on slavery while still maintaining credibility with both conservative and progressive factions. The second day covered baptism debates that had been simmering for months. The third day, October 22nd, was reserved for miscellaneous business and new concerns. That was when Kern made his move. He'd arranged with Hartford in advance to reserve time for a matter of professional conduct requiring church attention. Vague language that could mean anything from financial impropriety to doctrinal deviation. Hartford had granted him 15 minutes during the afternoon session. Kern used them all. He began by describing Dr. Crane's assessment practice in clinical terms, careful not to inject emotional language that would let listeners dismiss him as a radical. He explained the procedure, the extraction of healthy teeth from enslaved children, the timing of their silence as a metric for determining sale value. He noted that Crane charged for these assessments, that he kept records, that he'd built a practice around the methodology. Then he produced the photographs. The reaction in the chamber was immediate and visceral. Several clergy leaned forward to see better. Others recoiled. Kern passed the images along the front pews, letting them circulate while he continued speaking. "These specimens," he said, "represent 249 children who've undergone this procedure in the past 7 years. Each tooth was extracted without anesthetic, the child's pain used as a measurement tool. Dr. Crane displays them in his office as proof of his scientific methodology." "Is this confirmed?" Hartford asked. "These photographs, are they authentic?" "I have witnesses," Kern said, and gestured to the gallery where Rebecca, Thomas, Violet, and Joseph sat. 4 parents whose children were subjected to this assessment. They're willing to testify. The chamber erupted in conversation, voices overlapping as clergy debated whether such testimony could be heard, whether enslaved people could speak in this setting, whether the tribunal had authority to investigate a licensed physician's practices. Hartford called for order 3 times before the room quieted enough for him to speak. "This tribunal," he said carefully, "is not a court of law. We cannot compel testimony or render legal judgment. However, matters of moral conduct within our Christian community fall within our purview. If a physician who's a member of a Methodist congregation is engaging in practices that violate Christian ethics, we have both the right and the duty to examine those practices." He looked at Kern. "Your witnesses may speak." Rebecca went first. Rebecca's hands shook as she stood in the gallery, looking down at 63 white men in dark suits who'd stopped their conversations to stare up at her. She'd never spoken to this many white people at once. The fear was physical, a tightness in her chest that made breathing difficult. But she thought about Lily, her daughter, and the fear became anger, and anger gave her voice. "My daughter was 9 years old," she began. "Lily. Dr. Crane took her tooth on March 14, 1854. Said he needed to check her vitality. My owner, Mr. Daniels, he brought her to the doctor's office in the morning. Brought her back 3 hours later with her mouth full of blood and one of her back teeth gone. She couldn't eat right for 2 weeks. Couldn't tell me what happened because she was too scared. 3 days after, Mr. Daniels sold her to a cotton broker heading to Alabama. I never saw her again." She paused, steadied herself. "Dr. Crane keeps her tooth in a cabinet, has a little tag under it with her age and how long she stayed quiet while he pulled it. She lasted 38 seconds. He charged $5 for the assessment. My daughter's in Alabama and her tooth's in a cabinet, and that's what my baby was worth to the world." The chamber stayed silent when she finished. Hartford said, "Thank you," his voice rough, and gestured for the next witness. Thomas spoke about Marcus, about the moment his son's eyes rolled back during the extraction, about Dr. Crane's irritation that the child had proven too weak to complete the test. "My boy's 10 now," Thomas said. "Still can't go into small spaces without panicking. Something broke in him that day. Something that won't heal. Doctor says it's good. Science. I say it's torture with a fancy name." Violet described the twins, the comparison, the way Crane had seemed pleased that he could test siblings against each other. "He wrote down which one was stronger," she said, "like they were horses being graded. They're my daughters. They have names, Sarah and Ruth. But to him, they're just data." Joseph went last, his voice steady with the authority of someone who'd survived long enough to stop caring about consequences. "My son Daniel almost died from infection after Dr. Crane pulled his tooth. Took weeks before the fever broke. He's 13 now, and he still can't chew on the left side of his mouth. Every time he eats, he remembers what happened. That's not science. That's cruelty dressed up in medical language. When Joseph finished, Hartford asked the question that everyone was thinking. Dr. Crane is not present to defend himself. Should we not hear his account before rendering judgment? Send for him, someone said from the back pews. This isn't a trial, another voice objected. We're clergy, not magistrates. The debate lasted 20 minutes, fractious and circular, until Kern stood and said simply, "The photographs speak for themselves. 249 teeth from 249 children. The cabinet exists. The practice is documented. Whether Dr. Crane defends his methods or not doesn't change what he's done. The question before this body is whether we, as Christian leaders, will say that such practices are compatible with the faith we claim to serve." That reframed everything. This wasn't about legal authority or due process. It was about moral witness. And on that question, the tribunal found its spine. The tribunal's vote was 41 to 18, with 4 abstentions. The majority opinion, read by Hartford on October 23rd, stated that while Dr. Crane's assessments were legal under Georgia law, they were incompatible with Christian ethics and beneath the dignity of medical practice. The tribunal recommended that Crane be censured by the county medical board and that Methodist clergy in Hancock County refuse him communion until he publicly renounced his assessment methodology and dismantled his specimen collection. The recommendation carried no legal force. It couldn't revoke Crane's medical license or prevent him from continuing his practice. But it did something more damaging. It made his work visible and controversial in a community that valued respectability above almost everything else. Word reached Sparta within 3 days. Reverend Morris, Crane's father-in-law, received a letter from a colleague who'd attended the tribunal describing the photographs and testimonies. Morris confronted Crane on October 27th in the study where Crane kept his ledgers and correspondence. "Is it true?" Morris asked. "Do you have such a collection?" "I have scientific specimens properly obtained through legal means," Crane said. "I've broken no laws and violated no professional—" 249 teeth from children," Morris interrupted. "Is that true?" Crane hesitated. Then, "Yes." Morris sat down heavily. "Willard, I've defended you to your wife when she expressed concerns. I've told people you were a dedicated physician whose work required difficult choices. But this, a cabinet of children's teeth displayed like trophies. How could you think this was acceptable?" "It's research," Crane said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Medical science requires humanity," Morris said. "It requires recognizing that even those we consider property are God's creation. What you've done is reduce children to data. And now the church has seen photographs of your work and testified against it in front of 60 clergy from across Georgia. Do you understand what that means?" Crane understood. In a community where social standing determined everything, church censure was a death sentence for respectability. Planters might still use his services privately, but they wouldn't acknowledge him publicly. His wife's family would be humiliated. His standing in the medical community would erode. The cabinet that he'd considered his greatest achievement had become evidence of his moral failure. On November 2nd, 1855, Dr. Willard Crane closed his practice. He sent letters to his regular clients explaining that he was retiring from medicine due to health concerns. He donated his medical equipment to a colleague in Milledgeville and destroyed his assessment ledger, burning it page by page in his office fireplace. The cabinet itself he dismantled, removing the teeth and burying them in a cloth sack in the woods behind his property. The walnut frame he sold to a furniture dealer who had no idea what it had contained. He never practiced medicine again. He and Constance moved to South Carolina in 1856, where they lived quietly until Crane died in 1863, leaving no children and few records. His obituary in the Charleston Mercury made no mention of his work in Georgia. The 4 families who testified never saw their children again. Rebecca, Thomas, Violet, and Joseph all faced consequences for speaking. Rebecca was sold to a plantation in Alabama 6 months after the tribunal. Thomas lost his position as blacksmith and was reassigned to field work. Violet's owner increased her workload until she collapsed from exhaustion and had to be treated by Millie. Joseph died in 1857, possibly from natural causes, possibly from punishment that was never officially recorded. Millie continued her healing work until the Civil War brought chaos to Hancock County and freed the enslaved population. She lived until 1879, training 3 younger women in her knowledge before she died. None of them ever spoke publicly about the tribunal or the photographs. Nora Hale left Georgia in 1856 after the teaching ban became law. She returned to New Hampshire and worked with the Underground Railroad until the war made such networks obsolete. She died in 1892, and her papers included a brief note about the photographer and the preacher who made truth visible. Marcus Webb's trail goes cold after August of 1855. No records confirm where he went or what happened to him. Some accounts suggest he headed north to Canada. Others claim he stayed in Georgia, continuing to photograph enslaved families in secret until the war ended. The glass negatives he made of Crane's cabinet were never seen again after the tribunal, possibly destroyed to protect those involved, possibly lost in the chaos of the war years. Josiah Kern's ministry ended in 1861 when Confederate authorities seized the gospel star for military use. He survived the war and returned to Philadelphia, where he taught until his death in 1873. His journals, donated to a Methodist archive, make no mention of the Hancock County Tribunal or the photographs he carried in his piano. Some silences are strategic. The site of Dr. Crane's office in Sparta is now a coffee shop, the Masonic Hall having been renovated in the 1920s and converted to retail space in the 1980s. The examination room where the cabinet stood is part of the shop's seating area, with customers drinking lattes beneath exposed brick that once held anatomical charts and shelves of brown medicine bottles. No historical marker mentions what happened there. The County Historical Society's official records make no reference to Dr. Willard Crane or his assessment practice. But in the oral traditions of Hancock County's Black community, the story persists. Elders tell younger generations about the doctor who collected children's teeth, about the photographs that exposed him, about the 4 parents who spoke when speaking meant losing everything. The details shift with each telling. Sometimes the photographer is described as a woman. Sometimes the tribunal is in Savannah rather than Milledgeville. Sometimes the cabinet is said to still exist, hidden in someone's attic. But the core remains constant. There was a doctor, there was a collection, there was a moment when truth became visible, and people had to choose what to do with it. Some local historians claim the story is exaggerated, that Crane's collection was smaller than legend suggests, that the tribunal's censure was for other reasons. They point to the absence of documentation in official archives as proof that the tale has grown beyond the facts. But absence of evidence, as any researcher knows, is not evidence of absence. Georgia in 1855 was a place where certain stories were never meant to survive in official records, where documentation was a privilege extended selectively, and where the people most harmed by systems of power had the least access to tools of documentation. The teeth Crane buried were never found, or if they were, no one reported the discovery. 249 pieces of children scattered in Georgia soil, unmarked and unmourned in any official way, but remembered in the stories that communities tell when the histories they're given don't include them. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.